Hello and welcome to our webinar, Stories, Voices and Text in Secondary History. This webinar is presented by Christine Counsell, who is the series editor for our Key Stage 3 history course, Changing Histories. Now over to Christine.
Thank you very much indeed. Right, stories, voices and text in secondary history. That's the theme that I've chosen with which to talk about this new series, Changing Histories. The first book of which, Connected Worlds, which is for Year 7, is now out. And I'm going to share with you some of the rationale that went into it from me as editor, from my fellow editors, and from a very large team of history teachers who helped me work on it. But first of all, let's have a story before we even start. So, at 2 o'clock on the 30th of July, in the year 762, a tall man with a long beard stood by the river Tigris, holding a large brick. The tall man knew that this was the right moment. His royal astrologers had consulted the stars. The tall man's advisors, architects and engineers stood by. Along the banks of the Tigris, thousands of workmen looked on. Everyone watched. Everyone waited. Carefully, the tall man laid the brick. The building of the new city had begun. The tall man was Al-Mansur. This would be his new capital city, a capital fit for a great ruler of a Muslim empire. To mark the great occasion, Al-Mansur had special coins minted like this silver dirham. Muslim rulers were called caliphs. Al-Mansur had been caliph since 754. Since then, for 8 long years, he had fought rebel after rebel. Even now, in 762, the task was not complete. It would be another 5 months before his soldiers would bring him, on a silver dish, the last rebel's head. But Al-Mansur was hopeful. Surely, at last, he could bring the peace, security and prosperity that his supporters longed for. Al-Mansur wanted to reassure all Muslims that the stability was finally on its way, so he called his city Madinat al-Salam, City of Peace. It would soon gain another name, that of a tiny Persian village here before, Baghdad. Before building began, Al-Mansur had taken great trouble to test the brilliance of his city's design. It would be built in a perfect circle. Al-Mansur had asked his architects to mark out the plan of the whole city on the ground with cotton seeds. Oil had been poured over the seeds and set alight. Now Al-Mansur could see his future city as a giant circle of fire, a visible plan made of flames. What a sight it must have been. Al-Mansur is said to have exclaimed, "By God, I will live in this city all my life. It will be the home of my descendants. It will be the richest city in the world." So we're going to pause there. I'm going to break the spell of that story and just ask you to reflect on what might make that a good story in its own right, and also what might make it a useful story for teaching history, what might make it a very efficient way to do an awful lot. It's only taken me about 1.5 minutes to read it, but it has achieved an awful lot. Let's just have a little look at how that has happened. So the first key thing is the use of delay. I didn't mention his name until the second paragraph. Why? Because his name means nothing to children. It's more important that I build a sense of place first. I built expectation because of what the reader doesn't know, because of what the listener, the pupil, doesn't know. I concealed things, I withheld things. I did what all stories do. I presented something that leaves your head full of questions. Why is he there? What's going on? Why are all those people assembled? And deliberately use cinematic techniques. So I'm showing the people looking at the events, the workmen who are gathered, the people watching, the people waiting. So there's a sense that something is going to happen. Just basic tools really of storytelling, and story teaching too. And through that, I'm able to achieve appropriate pace. probably most central thing that history teachers need to practice over and over again, that in the best history ITT courses is absolutely central to learning how to teach the subject, how you do your pacing, so that the children are ready to hear the next thing and cannot wait for the story to unfold. What's going on is this is a story which shows before it tells. It withholds. It conceals as much as it reveals, as all storytelling must, and indeed as good history teaching must. It builds a sense of place. Quite a lot of work there is done to make us get a sense of where he is by the River Tigris, what it might have felt like, the size and the space and the enormity of it, and the enormity of this city, which he manages to map out with his circle of fire. Another reason why the story works is that it sustains a consistent viewpoint. I haven't quite gone as far as actually putting myself in role as Al-Mansur. It's more using a sort of Jane Austen free indirect style approach, but it's very clear that I'm telling the story from the viewpoint of Al-Mansur. I'd be telling it very, very differently if I did it in other ways, if I was trying to achieve something different. And that consistent viewpoint is vital. So often you see history teachers try to write a story and they've just slithered into telling children facts. They haven't sustained viewpoint in the way you have to in a novel or in a film. And crucially, it culminates in this famous moment, the circle of fire. It culminates in a vivid moment, a memorable moment. And what does that moment do in history teaching terms? It does so much work because it paints worlds. And in this case, it paints a huge range of worlds. For example, it tells us about technology at the time. There's no CAD/CAM. There's no way of getting a computer to do any modeling, but they do have very, very advanced mathematics. And they have been able to produce this huge circle, but he wants to see it, and he wants to see it at scale. So what does he do? He uses cotton seeds, oil, and fire, and numerous other things too that we gain a window into. Imperial motivation, structures of power, in fact, the way this man can control and command the work of thousands. That is an example of what we have tried to build all the way through this series. This series has taken 4 years now to build. The first book is published, the second book is in production and will be out early next year, and the third book is currently being written. And it took a long time because it takes a lot of work to gather the scholarship, to trial it, and it has been trialed in numerous settings, to gather the right authors. And I've been quite a fussy editor too about making sure that the texts are right. It's taken a long time, as many of you will know if you've tried to craft similar, to produce this material. But I really wanted to do something which I felt still needed to be done. I was series editor of another series 25 years ago, but actually, wonderful though that series may have been, and I thoroughly enjoyed producing the Minds series, which many of you may remember with the wonderful Jamie Byram and Michael Riley 25 years ago. Very, very pleased to have been involved in that. Things move on. Scholarship moves on. Great history practice move on. And I felt, no, there's another piece of work to be done. But another reason why I wanted to do it is just the workload issue, the amount of time it takes to craft stories which are also inquiries, to craft stories which connect up with each other so that there is coherence over the whole, to craft stories which academic historians have read and checked and reread and critiqued. That takes forever. And I think all history departments can do a small amount of that, a little bit at a time, but I felt, let's see if we can gather a huge range of terrific history education minds and see if we can produce something that will provide an ongoing stimulus to the debate, but particularly around the power of story to do so much work. And I want to say a huge thank you to the huge range of authors that you can see down there who've all worked with me on this series, and also those who've worked on the accompanying resources, the boost resources as well, but also to the many historians who've worked with us, who've checked our drafts, who've steered us into the scholarship, who've talked us through the sources, and who've done lovely little videos of themselves talking about the contents of the chapters, which you can also use for your own subject development, or you can use with the children. So what are we trying to do in this series? Well, we're trying to do exactly what heads of history have always tried to do. And I would say with history education discourse being rich and advanced now, so much terrific practice, and it's shared through blogs, it's shared through the journal Teaching History, so much terrific practice. We're all pretty clear about what we're trying to achieve, but it's so hard. I want to try and list now some of the problems that a typical head of history or a history network lead is trying to solve when they're trying to produce a Key Stage 3. And I'm going to present it as a set of tensions. You try to do one and the other one goes wrong. You fix that other thing and the first one goes wrong. How do you secure sufficient breadth, global breadth, cultural breadth, sufficiently representative histories, without losing overall coherence? I've seen numerous examples of work schemes where people are drawing on a huge range of different voices and settings in order to be truly representative, but it doesn't join up. And those people and places are not revisited over time. And this makes it even harder for children to remember. So how do you do both of those? How do you do those without compromising one? How do you make sure that you do both of those optimally? How do you make sure that one serves the other? So the small stories, if you like, feed the big stories. Secondly, how do we get all pupils, and especially lower retainers, pupils who might struggle, pupils who might find extended text challenging and so on, how do we get them hooked and keep them hooked? And yet at the same time, how do we avoid oversimplifying the past? How do we respect the complexity of the past? Do we have to compromise one to achieve the other? I would say not. Let's do both. But it does require an awful lot of in-depth research. And above all, it's going to require story, because it's through story we can convey complexity, but sustain attention. Third problem, third little tension. How do we emphasize material culture, that painting of worlds, that world building, so as to give pupils a real sense of period that can only come with depth, and yet at the same time weave much bigger political and social narratives, so that pupils have those broad frameworks, those broad chronological frameworks and narrative frameworks in which to fit things, so they can move about within their own knowledge, so they don't get chronologically lost. And then my final tension, how do we use stories to achieve all this and keep that really strong disciplinary dimension? We're going to tell a lot of stories. When are we going to be teaching children to be critical, doing all these fundamental, vital things, weighing sources, understanding that interpretations are constructs, learning the different kinds of argument about change, causation, and so on? How do we achieve that? How do we manage that tension? Okay, I'm going to give a fairly predictable answer to each of these, and it is a sincere answer to each one. The answer to the first is story. Small stories woven with big stories. The answer to the second one is stories. The answer to the third is story. And the answer to the fourth is story. I'm talking about small stories and big ones. I'm talking about different kinds of stories, stories coming from different angles. I'm talking about pupils themselves critiquing stories, clambering into stories. I'm talking about the story of a source, the story of a historian wrestling with a source. We can put story everywhere, and we can make story real and visible in the lesson now, but we can have a latent story that is actually serving, that is hidden in the ductwork, that is actually connecting things up across the whole year. So let's go into our next story. We're going to do the story of Adelard of Bath. Now, if we were a smaller group, and I think there are about 400 people have signed up for this seminar, and I think there's about 100 on the call, so we're definitely not going to ask this question. But if you were a smaller group, I would be asking you to put your hands up to answer the question, who teaches the 12th century Renaissance? And usually I find very, very few Key Stage 3 departments, secondary departments, sorry, do at Key Stage 3. And that's perhaps not for want of thinking it's important, but rather because there just isn't space or there isn't time to do it. Now, If the 12th century Renaissance is important, and I would contend that it is, then we need a way in. We need a story to hook the children. We need a way to get year 7 excited about it, fascinated by it. And we need them fascinated by it because it seems to me very wrong that we do a whole lot of stuff on, say, medieval church, we do stuff on medieval kingship and so on. We do a range of civilizations around the world. We might look at the way the worlds are connected up, and then, oh, we suddenly land in the 15th century and we're doing the Renaissance, as it popped out of nowhere. What about that world of ideas that is ongoing? And what about those other moments of change, like the 12th century Renaissance? Well, we may not want to spend a long time on it. Maybe we just want to fill in a gap, just spend a particular lesson on it. And I think it would be well worth spending one lesson on it because, my goodness, this story connects up so much. It certainly calls back, revisits, and connects up that story that we've just heard, the story of Baghdad and the emergence of the Abbasid Empire and those quests for knowledge of those Baghdad scholars. But it's also going to call up a range of other knowledge the children have already got. And it's going to feed forward. It's going to feed forward into numerous things. But it's going to call up too knowledge of the Crusades, of pilgrims and pilgrimages and the devotional Christian life, so much that it just crystallizes. It does so much work. It's not another thing. It's something that does work with what the children have already learned, and it's something that prepares children for what's coming later. But I want to do it fast. I want to do it in just one lesson. I don't want to do a whole inquiry on it. I just want to tell a story and give children some knowledge that's going to be functional and feed into something. So how am I going to do it? Well, we started out by thinking we might do it with John of Salisbury. And John of Salisbury is a great guy. He's ideal for year 7. He has all sorts of advantages because John of Salisbury, of course, witnessed the death of Thomas Becket. And when we first started, we actually wove a story around John of Salisbury, and we're going to get our Becket story in through that. But I wasn't happy. In the end, I didn't feel it did enough work. It didn't make enough connections across the book. So in the end, after we'd all done more reading and more talking, I hit on Adelard of Bath as the ideal guide to take us into the 12th century Renaissance. Now, why? Well, really quick backstory on Adelard of Bath. Adelard of Bath is a nobleman. He is put to a very, very strong education by his nobleman father because he was very talented, very bright. And he keeps getting pushed into more and more education. He ends up in the cathedral schools of northern France. But Adelard of Bath is frustrated by what he finds. He's frustrated by the many debates and arguments about theology. He says later that the theologians were simply making ropes out of sand. That's how frustrated he was with the quality of argument. No, he wants something better, and he knows there's something better out there. And above all, he knows that there is knowledge out there, and he wants it. He knows that the knowledge of the Greeks could be found, in particular, the knowledge of Greek mathematics. And why does he want mathematics? Well, all sorts of reasons, but he likes the logic of mathematics, and he thinks, if only we could understand more about mathematics and we could understand more about logic, if only we could get hold of that great book. He's seen fragments of it. He knows it exists, but he's never seen a whole copy of it. That great book, the greatest maths textbook ever, Euclid's Geometry. He knows it exists somewhere, but no one's got a whole copy of it. He can't find it. So he presses south. He presses south through France. He crosses the Alps. He goes through Italy. He goes to the medical schools of Salerno. He talks to scholars there, lots of doctors, lots of translators. Still, he can't find what he's looking for. He knows there's only one thing for it. He's going to have to press further south because he knows where this knowledge probably has been preserved. It is by the Arabs. He's going to go to Sicily. Of course he is. And there's another reason why you'd want to do Adelard of Bath, because of course pupils have already done Norman Sicily. If you've avoided an Anglo and Brit-centric view of the Normans, you've looked at the Norman diaspora. So we already know about Sicily. And we know how Sicily had the Muslim Arabs conquering it before the Normans. So on he goes further down to Sicily. And there he meets a bishop a bishop who's an expert in mathematics, and they discuss mathematics into the night. They discuss philosophy into the darkness. They discuss mathematics. They cannot get enough of it. But can they find any copies of Euclid? No, nowhere. And in the end, we think we can't be sure, but it's that bishop in Sicily who says to Adelard, you know what, there's only one thing for it. You're going to have to go into the world of the Muslims. You're going to have to go into the world of the Arabs in order to find this, because we know that they rescued this text in Baghdad and translated it. We don't know what happened to Adelard over the next 3 years. All we know is that 3 years later, he washes up in Antioch. So he's made it to Syria, no doubt along the crusading routes. And being a nobleman, he'd be well connected. So he'd been able to get there along the crusading routes with protection. So he gets himself to Antioch. And we know he's in Antioch because there are sources at the time that detail the earthquake that took place there. And Adelard himself describes sheltering under a bridge during that earthquake. Now, we don't know, but we know that he must have learned Arabic while he was there, because he comes back to Europe, again along the crusading routes, along the pilgrim routes. But he's carrying with him a heavy wooden chest. And what's in that chest? Year seven know the answer. He's carrying a copy of Euclid. But it's not in Greek. Of course it's not in Greek. It's in Arabic. Of course it is, because the scholars of Baghdad rescued those texts that had got lost in the collapse of those ancient empires. So he takes his copy of Euclid back to Europe and he translates it into Latin. So Euclid goes from Greek into Arabic and then back into Latin via Adelard. Adelard's writings thereafter are quite extraordinary. He has a different view of the Muslim world from the prevailing view at the time. So that's quite enough of the backstory. That's not the story, that's the backstory for you. I want to show you now how we introduce Adelard, and I invite you to think about the principles that I set out earlier and see if you can see them at work here. Very short story this time. I'm just going to introduce Adelard using what we call story text, which is text where we are really just creating a moment of absolute enchantment. It's something for the teacher to read aloud to the pupils. So the pupils have never heard of Adelard, and we don't want them to know that the lesson is even about Adelard. We don't want to do something boring like put objectives on the board at the start of the lesson. No, 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 no. We're going to go into our history lesson with a sense of mystery. So, in 1116, while Henry I still reigned in England, a wealthy English nobleman began his long journey home. For 7 years, the nobleman had travelled. His birthplace, the ancient city of Bath, was a distant memory. Finding his way back to England, the nobleman followed well-worn pilgrim routes. He travelled the roads and sea routes of crusading armies. He rested in monasteries. Wherever he went, his green flowing cloak turned people's heads. Who could he be? Once the noble traveller reached northern France, he visited the great cathedral schools in Tours, Paris and Chartres. Churchmen, monks and scholars remembered him from years before. They remembered how well he played the harp, how much he knew, how he loved to fly a falcon. But was he the same man that they once knew? He still had the same name, Adelard. But Adelard of Bath had changed. In 1116, Adelard was returning home with new eyes and a changed mind. So very briefly, in just a minute, I have framed my whole lesson. And I'm adding in a new ingredient of story here. In addition to the ones I gave you earlier, I'm starting at the end. Again, a classic storytelling technique. Can easily go wrong because it can confuse children, but if it's used well, it can work. And when we first trialed this, it was lovely to hear the feedback from it of how the children were just on the edges of their seats to know, who is this guy? Notice again, I delay giving his name because that, they're not going to take that in at the start. I want them in a heightened state of attention before I say his name. So let's have a think. about this heightened state of attention and a little bit more about story. A key function, one of many functions of story and history teaching, but I'd say it's the preeminent one, is the extraordinary effect of narrative on attention and memory, on attention and therefore on memory. Stories place the listener in a state of heightened attention. Cognitive psychologists tell us that story is psychologically privileged in that we're kind of wired to take in story. So let's just have a little bit more of a think about that. How do stories create a state of heightened attention? Well, some of this I've got at before in that list I gave you at the start, but let me put it in another way. What stories do is they make promises to the reader, to the listener, to the pupil, to the student. Any text you read is not a bucket of information. When I was training history teachers at Cambridge, you know, one of the things I would pick a teacher up on, you know, when they were, you know, really advanced and doing well is I felt you were just sharing 4 facts with them there. I didn't feel the relationship between the first fact and the second. I didn't feel you were sharing a text rather than a story. A text is not a bucket of information. It's not a series of isolated points. A text makes promises to the reader if it's got a narrative shape. Stories make promises to the reader because of what it withholds. In both the stories I've shared so far, we're withholding something. The name is a very obvious example, but we're painting a picture and my goodness, we're firing in questions to the child's mind. This is why when a teacher reads a story aloud to pupils, those pupils are not passive, they are super active. Their brains are firing on all cylinders, trying to make sense of it, just as we are when we're watching our favourite Netflix or a film or getting lost in a novel. How do stories do this? Well, stories work not through what they tell you, they work through the gaps, the spaces and the silences, to quote my favourite narrative theorist, Wolfgang Iser. Wolfgang Iser also said something which I find ineffably moving. He says that what happens in a novel in particular is that any one bit of it evokes the whole without ever giving you the whole. It evokes the whole without giving you the whole. You know when a history lesson's really great, when just in a tiny moment, that teacher is evoking the whole without giving you the whole. So those gaps and spaces and silences then make it pregnant with possibility. In other words, stories work through indirectness. Another way of putting this, I'd like to think of it as, having talked through the bit of the cognitive science there and the narrative theory there, let's now just get magical. I think it creates a quality of enchantment. This is an expression which Jacob Olivey and Mike Hill often use, teachers at Arc Sohn, who've written a lot about using story and developing text. And I love it, a quality of enchantment. It really captures, doesn't it, what a brilliant history lesson does, or a sequence of lessons in inquiry. The children are caught in like you've cast a spell and you don't want to break that spell till it ends. It's as thrilling as being in a novel. And that famous quotation by Jenny Parsons about how pupils who were so excited that one of them said, I get so excited about my next history lesson that I find myself dreaming about it before it happens. That's the quality of enchantment. It's the desire to get back to the novel or to keep watching the film. And why does this matter? Well, it matters because it helps memory. Vivid memories create lasting reference points and speedier assimilation of future material because of those reference points. So it's doing the heavy lifting of memory work for us, and it does it so efficiently. It creates time. And this is one of the reasons we've been able to create such a rich course in which children learn so much. It's because of the efficiency of stories. Why do we need to be in a state of heightened attention in order to remember things? Let's go back to a little bit of the cognitive science here. Well, you may know that when a memory is formed, it takes 3 stages. There's the first encoding phase, when the ear or the eye first encounters the new data, text, hearing something, seeing something. The first sort of impression, if you like, is made, the encoding phase. Then there's the consolidation phase, where we need to do something with it to make it stay there. And then, as I think most history teachers know now, because retrieval practice is everywhere, you need to keep retrieving that memory. In other words, you need to handle that forgetting curve and keep coming back to it and back to it and back to it until the forgetting diminishes. 3 stages to form a memory. The moment everyone's talking about retrieval and retrieval practice, checking up they already know it. Fine, okay, but it just misses a trick, because I think we often forget that it's that first stage that really does the heavy lifting. Get that first stage right, and you're going to make all the subsequent stuff much easier. We have to have children in a heightened state of attention for encoding to work at all at the kickoff. Encoding, the process of receiving and registering information, the first of the 3 stages, dependent on paying attention. And paying attention doesn't mean I've got a whole class listening. It means something about the substance of what we teach and how that substance, and I would say it's a textual substance, that the content, the subject matter of our subject is inherently an account, a journey. It's not meaningful to learn it in isolated pieces. So paying attention matters. So don't make the 3rd stage do all the heavy lifting. Don't make retrieval do all the heavy lifting. Do something remarkable in that first moment when that story embeds itself, the mood of it, the moment, the memory of it, the big plan, the big circle of flames. So we can also use stories to climb into much bigger ones. So it's not really, is it, just about the fact that stories are enjoyable and help you remember things. It's partly that stories are efficient in helping you do a lot with a little. So here's an example, a 3rd example of a story. And again, I'm just going to give you a tiny bit. I'm going to give you the opening bit, which acts as a window into something really big. Let's go now to the Renaissance proper. And maybe think about this in the context. You maybe do something similar, perhaps with a similar story. We were trying to achieve all sorts with this. We knew that we wanted a focus on women in the context of the Renaissance. There's a very strong focus on women throughout the whole book. But we wanted to capture the richness of all the Renaissance. We want children to know about Michelangelo. We want them to know about Titian. We want them to know about, the extremely famous settings and developments of the Renaissance. So how are we going to do it? We're going to use a small story to climb into a big one. Well, Sophonisba was perfect because Sophonisba finds herself tutored by a wide range of artists, including a couple of the very, very famous and influential ones. Seems to me there are 2 watchwords in structuring a great history curriculum. It must be representative and it must be consequential. There are developments in the Renaissance that are consequential. So we are representative in doing this, but we are also focusing upon making sure that we are not just taking one little corner of it and staying there, no matter how interesting it is, but we're going to use Sophonisba's story as access into a bigger story. But let's just show you now how we start. Sophonisba puts down her paintbrush. Remember the concrete start, the visual start, the vivid start, the questions that we want to plant in children's head. She is pleased. She has painted her 3 sisters, all delighting in their game of chess and in one another. The family servant looks on. Yet something isn't right. What will bring out the play of light on her sister's face? Sophonisba thinks about painting she has seen. She needs darker tones. She will add another tree behind her sister's head. It's just what's needed to complete her painting. So now we're going to follow Sophonisba, who, terribly convenient for year 7, lives to a ripe old age and ends up as a painter in the Spanish court, learns a huge amount on the way, travels around Europe, and so through her we can gain this bigger picture. Have a look at the inquiry box there. This is an inquiry which we launch in this particular way. Sophonisba did not paint alone. What she painted and how she painted were affected by changes in art before her, by mathematics and astronomy, and by her own experience as a woman at this time. At the end of this inquiry, you will build a visual collage to show the worlds that shaped Sophonisba's art. So small stories to climb into much bigger one. So Moving on then through these different functions of story teaching, I've gone through two of the most important ones. One is the heightened attention. Secondly, small stories to climb into much bigger ones. So let's now give another example of a small story to climb into a much bigger one. And I want to use it to show how we can solve a particular problem. My problem here is on the right. How do we help pupils access the meaning, material, culture, and experience of Christianity in medieval worlds? History teachers have debated this for decades. The vast majority of children have no religious experience, certainly won't necessarily have a Christian experience. And then we've got to get them interested in the church, the fabric of the church, the meaning of the theology of the church. It's fundamental if we're understanding the mingled political and religious origins of our institutions and of developments in this country, never mind the wider world. We have to understand the medieval church. But it's so alien for so many children. So how are we going to get in there and really understand it richly and deeply? Well, one way is to say what you're really trying to get the children to understand is the devotional life, what it means for ordinary people, why it mattered so much to them. And one way into the devotional life is to look at the cult of saints. And one way into the cult of saints is to look at just one saint. And this is what Rachel Foster did in a wonderful inquiry she wrote about St. Foy. I'm going to give you her the anglicised version. She'd probably be St. Foy in France. St. Foy. St. Foy was a Roman girl. We think she was probably caught up, historians think she was probably caught up in the persecutions in around 302, the Roman persecutions. We don't know much about her, but the sources say that she refused to take part in a Roman religious ritual. She refused to take part in sacrifice to the Roman gods. So she was tortured over burning coals. Then she was dragged to a temple and there she was beheaded. She was 12. So, St. Foy martyred in the early 4th century. Her bones are protected, venerated. A church is built around them in a little place called Argent. And she's protected and kept safe there, her bones. And of course, tremendous stories start to build around her. And she is the focus of devotion for the Christian community in that area. Now, I'd like you to zoom forwards. In the book, we do this much more slowly. I'm just giving you a backstory here. 500 years, zoom forwards, and a monk called Dado is standing over this lush green valley, staring into it and thinking, at last I have found a place where I will build my monastery. And boy, is Dado desperate to build that monastery because he needs to do penance. And he badly needs to do penance, because there's something that he's been trying to do penance for a very long time, and nothing he can do will really make up for the sin he committed, because he traded his mother's life, for a horse. So he's in a warfare situation and he allows his mother to be killed by the enemy so that he can have a horse. And he cannot forgive himself and he does not believe God can forgive him. But he thinks finally now, if he can found a monastery, that might help. So Dado then founds a monastery in this valley of Conques. Fast forwarding quite a long way, after a while, he finds there's an enormous problem. They need more money. There's just not enough money to sustain this. What will give us money? Well, we need something that will make pilgrims come here. And pilgrims are only going to come here if there are some relics of a saint. Let's look where Conques is on the map. It's on the pilgrim routes. It's an ideal setting. So if only we can get the pilgrims to stop off in Conques, we're sorted. Tricky though, we haven't got a saint, we haven't got any saints' bones. So on goes the story, and this story we were able to stretch across an inquiry and through it teach so much about why saints were venerated and why in particular their relics were venerated. Conveniently, the story is recorded. It's recorded in more than one source, but one particularly important source is the Book of Miracles by Bernard of Angers. It's a source which is problematical, and therefore that gives us even more to work with in terms of helping children to think about source evaluation and evidence. And so our inquiry is, what light can one saint's story shed on Western Christian worlds? Here we actually make the business of the small story opening into the big story the focus of the children's analysis. So by the end, they're actually going to analyse what this story can tell us, what kind of light it can shed. So we're almost getting the children to take a kind of critical angle, if you like, on how this process works. The story culminates, of course, in a classic story of a translation of a saint, where Dado manages to get another monk to steal the bones. And this other monk is a very crafty monk. He disguises himself as a priest, pretends to be a priest for 10 years to kind of inveigle his way in and ingratiate himself with the church around Argent, where Foy's bones are. And then after 10 years, when they really trust him, he does the deed. And in dead of night, he steals the bones, he steals the relics of Foy. You can imagine the suspense that leads up to this. And of course, everyone's setting off in hot pursuit. He's in dreadful danger. But fast forward now to the moment in the story where he's got the bones. He's managed to fend off his followers who are pursuing him. And he's arriving in the town of Conques, and the joy. So look at the picture there. We briefed the artist to capture a sense of joy. The children dancing, the people singing. They've arrived, the bones of St. Foy. St. Foy is wonderful because St. Foy is not only that our story continues now long after Conques with all the stories, all the hagiography around St. Foy. And she's known not only for working miracles such as healing people and stopping, helping the blind see, but also she has an eye for trinkets and jewels. She has a fondness for donkeys, and she has a liking for practical jokes, and she likes to play practical jokes on naughty people. So here's a naughty merchant who was stealing wax for his candles, and Foy punishes him by setting fire to his backside. And this is all recorded in Bernard's story, and we're able to get the children to read the source. So that's quite enough about that, but I wanted to give you a sense of that journey, the journey up to her finding herself in Conques, and then the journey afterwards, and what it's able to yield in terms of understanding of Christian worlds. Let's have a look now at how we begin that story. So here is another story for you. I'm going to slow down and read it. And just to remind you then of what we're trying to achieve on the left and our principles of good storytelling on the right. Okay, this is one for us to enjoy. This is how we start the inquiry. In 1013, two travellers slipped into the cool quiet of the church. They were monks. Christian holy men who had dedicated their lives to God. They had travelled hundreds of miles to a tiny village called Conques in what is now southwestern France. Now, finally, they would meet her, the girl they had come so far to see. The two monks inched their way forwards through the crowd. The church heaved with people. Finally, straining their eyes against the gloom, they caught a glimpse of her, shimmering in the candlelight. Covered with gold and precious stones, she was seated on a throne. In a small box resting on her lap were the remains of a young Roman child. The two travelling monks were staring at a statue. But the girl that had brought the travellers so far was not living. She had been dead for 700 years. Her name was Foy, meaning faith, and she was a saint. The monks had heard the stories about the statue, about the girl who had lived centuries before them, and about the miraculous powers of her bones. She could heal the sick, make the blind see, and bring the dead back to life. She also had an eye for trinkets and jewels, a particular fondness for donkeys, and a liking for practical jokes. So that's our opening moment at the beginning of our inquiry into the medieval church, and off we go. And through it, we learn about everything, really, the parish, monks, nuns, the practices of the church, the connection, the political connections of the church. It's all in there because it's the ideal story through which to capture these. And the children are enchanted as they work their way through. Let's switch to another function of story and let's change religion. Stories do world building. They build worlds. I've illustrated that with the stories so far, but I want to just give you an example now of a moment where we go back in time to the city of Mecca. And why are we going back in time to the city of Mecca? Because in our Islam inquiry, we need to do our first Islam inquiry. We need to do a little bit of a backstory. Children ought to know the story of the Muslim armies bursting out of Arabia from primary school. Unfortunately, we can't rely necessarily on the quality of the primary curriculum. So I think this often is needed, isn't it, as a bit of a backstory. And most heads of history I speak to now say they do feel a need to teach this. Now, I spend most of my time working on a primary curriculum, which is another story. And there we do this very, very thoroughly. So I think in the long run, we shouldn't need to tell the story of ancient Arabia, the birth of Muhammad and the emergence of Islam. But I think for the moment, perhaps we do. So how do we do it? Well, we could be very boring and we could just say Muhammad was believed to be born at the end of the 6th century. He was born in the city of Mecca, da, 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 da. I'm bored already. Let's do it differently. Let's build the world into which he is born. The whole city seems to move. Through sun-baked sandy streets, long lines of camels pad their way. Some camels head north to the Christian lands of the Byzantine Empire. Some are bound northeast for Persian lands. Some move west to the Red Sea, where boats will carry their goods to Egypt. Some head south for the perfume markets of the Yemen in Arabia's southern tip. Here, in the city of Mecca, wealthy merchants trade. Merchants sell perfumes from East Africa, cotton from Egypt, silks from China, linen from Persia, and slaves from everywhere. Around the edges of the city, desert tribes camp. Everywhere we can see their tents of black goat's hair. These desert tribes will sell dates, oil, camels, and leather goods. Now look at the center of Mecca. See the large black temple, the Kaaba. Around it sit hundreds of sacred objects, Christian statues, Jewish pictures, pagan idols of gods and spirits. This part of the city too seems to move. Pilgrims circle the ancient desert shrine. They make sacrifices to the gods. Something is about to happen in Mecca that will change the world. Delay, delay, delay. This is such an important moment. I'm not just going to fling it at the children as a fact. I'm going to move in there slowly. And I want them visualizing Mecca because later in the story, when, according to Muslim tradition, Muhammad returns to Mecca and manages to conquer the Quraysh tribe, going in there, and he shows respect to the Kaaba. It's one of the first things he does. That story is only going to carry meaning if the children already understand what Mecca was all about in religious terms. So something like this is doing so many jobs, planting so much for later. So another function of storytelling then is simply world building. Okay, another feature of the book series that helps handle this is that I've talked about the fact that we have some standard inquiries, a single inquiry question governing 4 or 5 lessons, which I'm sure everybody is familiar with. But we also have these little story summaries, which don't culminate in an inquiry question, that just pop in. And most of them begin with the word meanwhile. Meanwhile in Poland, meanwhile back in the Tudor court. So they're like little moments that just take us somewhere else in the world and then just bring us back again. And this is one of the ways in which we've been able to build a course where we can achieve quite a lot. So we don't have to be treating everything to the full inquiry treatment. We can just do little moments in between. So there are stories in the inquiries and launching the inquiries, like the ones I've already shown you. But then there are things which we call story summaries. So that's an inquiry. What shaped the art of Renaissance painter, which children answer at the end. But then we have these little story summaries, which are just for 1 lesson, 2 if you really want, in between the inquiries. And they take us all over the shop again, allowing us to connect up. Notice the big focus on astronomy. Well, why do we want that? Notice it's before the one on Sophonisba. Well, because we want the pupils to know about astronomy before we learn about the Renaissance. And we want to see the connection. So look at the connection in the titles. Nicholas Copernicus studies the beauty of the heavens. Sophonisba Anguissola studies the beauty of the earth. And all the usual suspects are there too. We don't do classic causation for our Norman conquest. We do change and continuity because we feel that's much more in tune with what scholars are asking, rather than, the boring or rather hackneyed. It's not boring, it's interesting, but it's hackneyed now, and it's not really what scholars are asking. Why did William invade? Why was William successful? Why did the Normans come? And sometimes schools spend weeks and weeks on that, We feel that can be done quite quickly, and would rather have a bigger focus, which is how disruptive were the Normans, because it's a genuine question. There's so much to argue about, and we can really look at different types of sources and have the children really arguing about how disruptive the Normans were. It's genuine debates among historians. So examples of inquiries, examples of story summaries. Okay, the last big thing I want to emphasize around the power of stories is sources. You might be thinking, oh, stories, sources, don't we need sources as well? And I've seen some very sort of clunky versions of doing this. We'll tell them a story, then we'll give them a source. Let's just have a broader look for a moment at what goes wrong with source work. And I think this will be very familiar to present company. And this is not new. People were moaning about this 25 years ago, and plenty of solutions have been found. The reasons why these problems persist is, well, range of factors. I think one particularly major factor is the nature of our GCSE questions, but it's also other things around culture of schools. But anyway, what goes badly wrong with source work? You'll know what I mean. It's often treated as something separate. I used to say to my trainees, never ever use the expression source work. Never say we're now going to do source work, whether it's Key Stage 3 or GCSE, as though it's a separate thing, as though it's some sort of skill you practice on its own. Even when it's integrated, it's often treated as a set of procedural skills. You do these things, you press this button, you pull this lever, and out pops an appropriate answer. And it results in a thing called death by sources A to F, where we think of sources as little boxes. As a result of this kind of very impoverished work with sources, the whole concept of evidence, which was the point, isn't really fostered at all. Some kind of proxy thing is invented for these proxy genres that are GCSE questions. And we are in a period now where you see much less of this, largely because Ofsted is so critical of it. If you have a look at Tim Jenner's research review, he's really, really critical of the use of GCSE questions at Key Stage 3, and he's crystal clear on why great history teachers never, ever do that. But it's still there, it still persists, and it's very, very damaging, because those GCSE questions, driven by command verbs, they're nothing to do with really evaluating, weighing, and using sources. And the range of source types often remains thin. You get to the end of the key stage and the children actually haven't done the full range of sources. They're not good at looking at oral accounts, for example. They're not good at looking at different kinds of artifactual evidence that you might find in the Americas or in Africa. They're not good at integrating the written source with the environment. And they've been doing history now for a very long time. Put it together with primary, they've been doing history for 7 years, and the range of sources they encounter is thin. And another problem is that integration is just simply not sustained. We might do something on sources now, but in the next inquiry, we're not kind of using that knowledge and blending it with a different disciplinary focus. So what do we need to do instead? Well, this is nothing new here. History teachers have written about this in teaching history for 30 years, and many of you will be familiar with much that I'm saying on the right. But it seems to me that it needs doing, and it needs doing grandly, and it needs doing well across a full course, and that was our intention. So we need to make sources always part of an inquiry journey, never some extra thing bolted on. Always there's something we're using en route to something as part of answering a question, whether our primary focus is evidential or not. We need to show pupils how a story has been informed by particular sources. So what's the relationship with evidence here? We need to spend time with a source. We need longer sources sometimes. We need to slow down. And one of the reasons why you need long time with a source, because you don't really hear the voice of a source until you stay with it for plenty of time. I used to say to my trainee teachers, longer sources are easier for lower retainers. Longer sources are easier for lower retainers because it gives them time to get in there. So don't try and do short sources because you think it's going to be easy. Make it easy for them to do it by giving them longer sources. Let them stay with one source. Let's look at one particular type of source across a sequence of lessons and really get to know it. And what's the story of the source? How did it emerge? Don't just, tack on some ghastly annotation of the source. We're going to do NOP, the nature of provenance thing. No, tell the story of the source. And what about sources themselves that tell stories? Let's use those as well. Or let's follow the journey of a historian who has used a source or a source collection and make that the story. And let's secure progression in the range of source type encountered. So across Key Stage 3, let's treat the curriculum as the progression model. Let's not work our way through some hierarchy of skills that's meaningless. Let's make sure they've encountered this kind of oral source in this contrasting settings, that they've encountered this kind of visual source and in contrasting settings. Are you building types of source? Are you making types of source into your progression model? So, as I say, all of this has been written about extensively, and you can see a summary of it in things like What's the Wisdom On in Teaching History, so it's not new. But although it's not new, we still see a lot of the old problems, and we still see we see textbooks which don't do this particularly well, and we see various factors encouraging history teachers actually to do it really quite badly. So I wanted to try and create something that really does everything on the right-hand side well. Let's just have a little look at the bottom one there, secure progression in the range of source type encountered. So for example, when we look at the Incas, we look at a range of different types of sources, and our inquiry is a story. It's a story of how historians use sources to study the Incas, and it's going to include the environment. It's going to include things like climate change, because they're trying to work out exactly how and when the Incas developed and the different theories about that. It's going to include problematical sources. It's going to include the importance of oral tradition and how to respect that. Or let's take the story of how something was uncovered and developed. So this is how Hannah Cusworth has written the story of African Tudors. She tells the story of Miranda Kaufman. Have a little look at how it begins. In the cool, dark library, the desks are lit by little lamps. Under their light, Miranda rereads the source that the historian has quoted. Diverse blackamoors crept into this realm. Her mind races. If so many black people had come to Tudor England, surely there must be other traces of them in the sources. Notice again, I'm sustaining viewpoint here. For this bit, we're sustaining viewpoint of Miranda Kaufman. A few weeks later, in the autumn of 2004, Miranda steps off the train at Kew Gardens. She walks towards the National Archives. She is determined to know more. How many black people were in Tudor England? Why were they there? What was their status? Miranda had studied the Tudors at school and at university. No one had told her about African people living in Tudor England. Surely among the millions of documents stored in the National Archives, something could be found. You won't find anything about that here, says the archivist, and so on. So we take the story of the historian there and gradually move in. And likewise, we do something with the Wars of the Roses. And there, Helen Castor is our guide. We use a different style again, trying to make each one feel different. And look at how Helen Castor helps us. Here I'm going to the very end of the chapter. So this is the end of inquiry. The children have done their various, oh, sorry, I beg your pardon. No, it's not. It's the beginning of the inquiry. I beg your pardon. It's a summary of what they're going to be doing. And the first step that they're going to do is just underneath. It's like piecing together a jigsaw with half the pieces missing, says the historian Helen Castor. So this is real source work that is not source work. So my last example for you, and that is a source that we take a lot of time to love. And where better to look than Eamon Duffy's use of the church accounts of Sir Christopher Trickey, the priest. So Christopher Trickey, who very, very conveniently is priest from 1520 to 1574. I need say no more to this audience about how useful that is. And what is great about this source, those of you who've read Voices of Morbath will know, is that Sir Christopher Trickey is ever so naughty. He doesn't just write the accounts. He writes all sorts of comments about what's going on. And we talk about, it captures the voices of Morbath, because we feel the pain of this village as successive waves of change come in. This is a village devoted to its saints. It has stores, the young men's store, the young maidens' store, St. Anthony's store, where a few sheep raise money for little candles, which the young men or the young women put in front of their favourite saints. And the wonderful thing is, this account book actually starts to show how the villagers coped when Edward VI came along and said, no candles in front of saints. What did the villagers do? They were very crafty. No candles in front of saints. So, I know, we'll put the candles beside the saints. And so it goes on. And the stories are quite extraordinary. They spend 8 years saving up for wonderful vestments for the priest, only for the injunctions to come in and say they're not allowed to have vestments. What do? They do not hand them over. They pass them around the village and keep them secret. It's all in the account books. So here we have one source that we stay with and we look at bit by bit, and we have the historian guiding us through it, and it forms our inquiry. Let's just have a little look at how we're doing for time. Okay, I'm going to keep going. Let's have a little look at how we launch this. And you'll see names and things here. Bear in mind that, again, we're dealing with this problem of children not knowing about churches, but this is quite late in our course. So children do now know about the cult of the saints. So this will carry a lot of meaning for them. But we're going to dig in now to real people. And these real people are going to be affected, and it's all documented in Sir Christopher Trickey's accounts. Let me just give you a quick flavour of this, or we'll run out of time. This is written by Steve Mastin, and it's based on what he taught for years in his comprehensive school in Cambridgeshire. The sun is setting in the little Devon village of Morbath. Inside Morbath's stone church, the only light comes from candles. Candles burn at the front near the altar. Candles light the crucifix showing Jesus hanging on the cross. Candles catch the colours in the images of St. George and the other Christian saints. Mary, the mother of Jesus, dressed in blue, has a crown of flowers on her head. Staring up at the beautiful image of Mary is a villager called Marjorie Lake. Marjorie is on her knees praying. She counts each prayer using her rosary beads. The beads help Marjorie to concentrate. She can forget her troubles for a while. Marjorie often comes to church to ask Mary for help. She calls Mary Our Lady. Marjorie says her prayers in Latin. She does not speak Latin. She knows many Latin prayers. She knows the Pater Noster and the Ave Maria. Meanwhile, men are returning to Morbath from their work in the fields. They pass the noisy workshop of Thomas Glass. Thomas is carving a splendid new image of St. George. This image is even bigger and better than the one in the church. St. George, like the other saints, has his own special side altar and his own special altar cloth. The church bursts with colour. Okay, so moving on, we then introduce the children to Sir Christopher, going down into the penultimate paragraph there. Many in Morbath listened to Joan's advice, even Sir Christopher. Sir Christopher is the new priest. When he arrived in Morbath last year in 1520, Sir Christopher gave something special to the village. It was an image of a female saint. All the parish were delighted, but especially the girls and young women. The saint is Saint Sidwell. They placed her near Our Lady. As its priest, Sir Christopher Trickey is at the heart of this village's life. He baptizes them, marries them, buries them. When they are troubled, he advises and, with stories of heaven, gives them hope. So on we go into our story. And as we introduce the children to the book, we introduce them to Eamon Duffy, and then we tell the story kind of in tandem with Eamon Duffy's discoveries. The children are doing a change continuity inquiry, but one with a very strong evidential thread. So in the middle, for example, we look at what Eamon Duffy was able to extract from the book, from the actual accounts, and look at those dates on the left. Surprise, surprise, the receipts for the different stores are suddenly diminishing as they are no longer allowed to develop this devotion for the saints in this particular way. But my goodness, they develop crafty ways to avoid it and do keep some of their customs and traditions. So the agency of a village comes through here. The multiple voices of a village comes through here. And it's all achieved just through a text which sustains that flow. So I did this one in the context of my point about sources and stories being friends, but it's also an example of small stories climbing into bigger ones, because we're back to the cult of the saints. So there's Eleanor Nichol staring up at her beloved saint. And once again, we're continuing to touch base with this fundamental issue, understanding the devotional life and the cult of the saints. I think we'll just go to the end of the inquiry now. It's rather moving. And we'll take a little extract from Eamon Duffy's book. So enjoy the conclusion of the story with me now. By the 1570s, Sir Christopher was old, but he was still the priest and still writing in his book. When he died in 1574, the villagers must have been in shock. Sir Christopher had been their priest for 54 years. Sir Christopher's body was placed where he had asked to be buried, under the communion table, or as Sir Christopher was still calling it, under the altar. Let's read the last paragraph of Professor Eamon Duffy's book. He had been their priest, Catholic and Protestant, for 54 years. For 54 years, the heart and voice, above everything else, the voice. He had been the spirit of Morbath. He had baptized their children, buried their dead, married every one of them. Perhaps Morbath knew that with Sir Christopher Trickey they had lost something unique, and that there, between the altar and the table, they had buried something of themselves. To link it in again with one of our other functions of stories, how do we conclude it? Well, we do something which we do a lot in these books. We give children insight into the story writing process itself, so they understand that its powers are seductive. They understand that story itself is manipulative. And here they write a story, drawing on all that they've learned. So it connects us through into another aspect of the discipline, types of argument, in this instance, change and continuity. And all our inquiries end with either shaping your answer or shaping your argument. Here's another example of the same thing. So at the end of the conch inquiry, look at what the children do. St. Foy feels like one very small story, yet learning about how medieval people treated Foy has helped you understand something much bigger, Western medieval Christian worlds. Through our focus on St. Foy, the places she was taken and the people who loved or feared her, you have thought about what Christians did and believed, what they could see around them and what it all meant to them. You are now going to reorganize your notes, which they've been taking in little bite-sized pieces as they go along, in short summaries which answer our inquiry question. What light can one saint's story shed on Western Christian worlds? And we've created the little diagram for you there, which you can copy for the children. They create these shafts of light. What light does that story shed on those broader questions of Christian worlds? Okay, last couple of points then about stories. It's important that we don't just mention sources when we're doing an evidential inquiry or when we're having a major focus on sources. Do we kind of forget all that stuff when we're doing everything else? So look at this in the middle of the Adelard story. I've just plucked this at random from something we did earlier, from the chapter that's about Adelard. And look at just this paragraph of how we're just doing what I call an evidential nod, just reminding pupils about the source record. It is hard for modern historians to piece together Adelard's life. The sources are patchy. Nonetheless, for historians who write about him, Adelard feels alive. He scribbled witty comments in margins, sharing jokes with others who had worked on the same texts. Through Adelard's scribblings, and I would always say to the children here when I was teaching, if we get very, very quiet, we can almost hear the chatter of scholars at work in the translation rooms all those centuries ago. Every single encounter with source with a child should be magical. It is astonishing that this has been left over from the past. Let's make it magical by putting it in a story. And the moment we choose to say that, the moment you choose to teach it in the lesson, should be governed by what children already know about Adelard. The same is true, I think, of any inquiry that's not primarily evidential. We do it in the Baghdad inquiry as well. And this last point about stories, I think is very, very important. It's an efficient, memorable introduction to broader content through sustained viewpoint. So this is just a bit further on the Baghdad inquiry that we began with. And so I return to this at the end. We're talking a little bit further on here, and we're talking about Al-Mansur developing his city and thinking about his city and how he's going to build it. And Al-Mansur has a friend called Barmak, a Persian friend, a very learned man who they were endlessly discussing together. So look here what we do. We want to get the children understanding an awful lot about the context. So we use our imaginations. We imagine a conversation between Barmak and Al-Mansur. Don't make the conversation up, but we certainly do know they were constantly in conversation. And we know that Barmak chose the site for Baghdad. He pointed it out to Al-Mansur. Look at what I'm doing here in the middle of this inquiry to convey a huge panorama with a tiny human scale. Let's picture Al-Mansur and his learned Persian friends sailing down the river Tigris, searching for the best site. What would they have talked about? They would have surveyed the rich farmland which could supply Baghdad with wheat, barley, rice, and dates. All those wealthy farmers and traders could pay taxes too. Al-Mansur would need this wealth to build a city and stock its libraries. They would have discussed the latest poems of the court poets. Al-Mansur loved the traditions of Arabic verse, now enriched by Persian traditions too. Al-Mansur once had a poet flogged for writing poor poetry. They would have talked of the tragic loss of ancient Greek books on science, mathematics, and astronomy. Like many Persian nobles, Barmak could read ancient Greek. They would have talked of the great mathematician Euclid, whose astonishing book on geometry was now 1,000 years old. How Al-Mansur loved Euclid's book. It contained the secrets of a perfect circle, secrets that had fired Al-Mansur's dream of a round city. Connecting up, connecting up, connecting up. We stay close to the sources, we stay close to the scholarship, but we use our imagination to picture his curiosity, his drive, his delight. We structure the course overall with some clear centres of gravity that we repeat. Baghdad is one of those centres of gravity. And this is the way, isn't it, as many history teachers have discussed recently, to do a lot with a little. You have places that you keep coming back to. Those are some examples of places that we keep coming back to across Year 7. In our Year 9 book, Fragile Histories, there are some more examples of places we keep coming back to. So the children are eyes wide with delight. Oh, we're there again. Gosh, what's happening here now? And here, to finish up, is the Year 7 book, but I've captured it in a way that helps you see it faster than just looking at the contents page. In the darker colours are the inquiries. In the lighter colours are the story summaries. And you can see worlds in the year 1000. Obviously, we start off with the Byzantine Empire and Constantinople. Vital, I think, to start in the Eastern Mediterranean in Year 7 and not in the Western Mediterranean. And vital for two major reasons. Because when we do the Crusades, we want to understand the Crusades began, don't they? They begin in the Byzantine Empire. They begin with Alexius in desperation asking the Normans for help from his Muslim invaders. And it goes very badly wrong. But if we can't picture that Eastern Mediterranean world, we're not going to unlock that later. We'll end up leaving children thinking that the Crusades began with Pope Urban's speech, rather than beginning with Alexios in Constantinople. Then we build Islamic civilizations first, then we build the Western Christian world through the story of Conch. In contested power, contested land, the next one, we sustain our British thread a little bit more, we get that going, but we keep weaving it with those bigger pictures and a very big focus on Eleanor of Aquitaine, through which we tackle the Angevin Empire. The third block, expanding empires, expanding empires. We do 3 expanding empires, so they really get a sense of this late 13th century, early 14th century. Everywhere is expanding. The Mongols are expanding. And we finish up with, guess what? The attack on Baghdad. Hugely meaningful for the children because Baghdad is one of our centers of gravity. We then look at the expansion of Mali in North Africa. We look at Mansa Musa, and that continues our study of Islamic worlds. And then we look at Edward's expansion. Everybody's expanding at this time until disaster strikes, until the Black Death, and so on and so forth. And you can see we weave right the way through, and we finish the whole book with a study of how Elizabeth's worlds and Elizabethan worlds were connected with wider worlds. So a very different focus on Elizabeth from that we normally do. We cover all the usual suspects. The Reformation is tackled there, and it's been tackled earlier too, particularly through Morbath. But there we look at the connections with wider worlds, the beginnings of empire. And finally, in the Mediterranean, we follow the journey of a Venetian spy, traveling around the Mediterranean, and what does he visit? All the places that we know. So that's it. I present to you Connected Worlds, the first of the Changing Histories book. I hope you like it. I've summarized the devices on the right. I hope you find it helpful, inspiring. I hope it stimulates debates. And I hope that it will save you loads of time. Don't forget that there are boost resources which go with it. And the boost resources, which you can purchase separately, the boost resources have little interviews, little podcasts, where we have an experienced teacher talking about how they trialed it. And they have a conversation with the author. So the author of the chapter talks about how they wrote it, and the experienced teacher interviews them. And then the experienced teacher talks about how they've taught it. And that is really, really illuminating. If you're not used to working with story or extended text, those little interviews are so, so helpful. And that's too where we have things like schemes of work, where we have different routes through the book. So if you haven't got time to do all this, fine, we can show you how you can make it work with just 2/3 of the book, or even half the book, in fact, if you really find you haven't got enough time. So that is what is in Boost, which is an additional resource, and it includes those things. And that's why I said leave the questions to the end, because people usually ask about these things. So these are all the things which you will find in the Boost resources. So I'm going to read one final opening, which is the opening to the Elizabeth one, and because it contains my final point about story. We can also have stories about stories. So why don't we open our chapter about Elizabeth and her connection with wider worlds with the great storyteller himself, Shakespeare. His rooms are dark. Notice we quite deliberately often start with people's rooms and we talk about the light. Candlelight flickers across books scattered on his desk. He has just read the tale of an Italian soldier born in the Muslim world of North Africa. Notice how everything in those first 3 sentences, is already recognizable to the children because of what they already know. Tonight he starts another, Leo Africanus's description of Africa. Born in Spain, Africanus had travelled to Morocco before being captured, enslaved, and taken to the Pope in Italy. The man reading is William Shakespeare, England's famous playwright. Tales of Africa and Islam are always popular, and Shakespeare likes to please an audience. He recalls the hubbub surrounding the arrival of ambassadors from Morocco in 1600. Londoners still talk of the Moroccans' deep black robes, their white turbans, and their fine curved swords. Blending these memories with books he has read, Shakespeare begins shaping a new story. A North African soldier will be trapped between the African world of his youth and his new world of Venice. The sounds of Southwark drift up from the streets. His rooms are humble, a far cry from the rooms he had once rented among the city's merchants, and farther still from the grand home he has bought for his family in Stratford-upon-Avon. He moved here to be closer to the new theatre. 3 years earlier, Shakespeare and his company of actors had transported their old theatre, timber by timber, across the river to Southwark, They were like Hercules carrying the globe on their backs, they said. They called their new theatre the Globe. Okay, everybody, that's it. Thank you very much indeed. I hope you found that interesting and stimulating for your own planning. And if you're interested in the books, then I hope you find it helpful in making a decision about whether you'd like to purchase them. I am now going to open the chat.
Thanks, Christine. We have got a couple of questions in the chat already.
Great. Oh, lovely question. Thank you, Sarah. Do you deliver stories with the text in front of the students, or do you read without? When you listen to the teachers on Boost talking about how they do it, there are so many different ways of doing it. I think the most common approach is reading aloud with the children following. But we also recommend sometimes, just if you've got to know the story really well, or a little chunk of it, just tell the story freely yourself and do some formal teaching of it, work orally with them, maybe just a couple of images on the PowerPoint, but no text, and then go to the text later when they're already secure in the vocabulary. So 2 different ways, I think, but certainly reading aloud with the children and with them following. Oh, well, that's a huge question, Mark. Hello, Mark Cottingham. I haven't mentioned it, but that's not because it's not important. It's staggeringly important. And I think actually empathy is another word for a great deal that I've been talking about. You know, we're making sense of other voices. We're trying out other people's ideas in our own mind. We're inhabiting certain viewpoints. We're encouraging children to imagine worlds that are not their own. The issue of empathy is fundamental, yes. And I think, yeah, in the best sense in which it's always been used in history education. So I didn't use that particular word, possibly because its connotations, it gets misunderstood. And because we still see really dodgy empathy exercises where people imagine that if you write in the first person, you're empathizing. You know, that was trashed 25 years ago, but it hasn't gone away. So I've perhaps avoided using the word, but absolutely, we're in the spirit of empathy. Next question, timeframes. Yeah, we're well aware that if you only have 1 hour a week, which is a shame because I think you do need more, then if you can still teach it. If you go to the Boost resources, you'll see they've done kind of like what we've done is we've said, look, what's the microwave version of this book? What's the ordinary oven cook version of the book? And what's the slow cook version? So the slow cook version would be those happy people who have 2 hours a week and a 3-year Key Stage 3. And they could probably do the whole book pretty much, you know, if you're doing the story summaries in 1 lesson. But if you haven't got that much time, then fine. And we've shown you a kind of different alternative work schemes where you could miss some of the stories out and it still works pretty well. The threads still work pretty well. So I think you can do a shortened version. You can do a microwave version and still get tremendous benefit out of it. I think that Salma, that's an interesting question. I mean, I would be I'm much more comfortable perhaps with the idea of moving chronologically through because I think it gives you time to sustain it and build it. However, I think year 9, and you will see this in our year 9 book when it comes out, is the place for circling back and revisiting. So for example, in year 9, we are circling back not just to the medieval world, but right back to the Mesolithic era. In other words, we're going to do that big sweep across time. And we're going to do it particularly for looking at environmental history, which has cropped up in various places in the books. So I would certainly use year 9 to circle back, and the year 9, a couple of the stories, one of the stories and one of the inquiries in the year 9 book does that. Personally, I would be less worried about leaving medieval behind because you're not leaving it behind. The references back to the medieval are extensive, just as the references back to the ancient world are extensive. I would move forward, not totally chronologically, because you're in different parts of the world at different times. But when you're in year 9, I would build in some really strong thematic inquiries or strong thematic story summaries that allow you to circle back and capture some threads going through. I think that's it for questions, Victoria.
Great. So, oh, one popped in there? If you've got time.
Yes,
You
I
take
have.
that as the last one. Thank you.
Go on. Yeah, sure. So, because students themselves have been to respond to the historical stories we study, and they often write first-person narratives, poetry, and produce artwork. Oh, that's lovely. And actually, I think you'll find that we do this all the time. And if you've got tremendous integration, you know, if you've maybe got some collaborations with your English department, they could spend, that's something that I did when I was a deputy head, created collaborations with English so that the really creative work could actually use quite a lot of English time too to do the sorts of things you're doing. So tips for enabling students to respond in their homework and classwork. I think those tips exist in the way we've structured each inquiry. I would say, I've tended to show you beginnings and endings of inquiries here. I would say it's in the quality of your steps that you use. We call them steps, but mini activities as you work through your story. If you picture each inquiry really as a narrative journey, isn't it? And an analytic journey as you're working towards a disciplinary question. And really, when you're planning history, you're marrying the narrative and you're with the analytic and you're moving through that journey. The quality of the outcome, whether it's something a little bit more creative, whether it's something where they're kind of recasting the story in a different way, whether it's something where they're being explicitly critical and argumentative, the quality of that outcome, whatever it is affected by the quality of the texts, the stories you've used as you've gone along, the rigor of the history. But it's also affected by the steps or stages as you go along. So, you know, I think it always helps if each step in that journey is very, very similar, because then you get a cumulative effect. So you're building a set of themes, or you're building a way of looking at the story through a particular lens, or you're looking at the story again and again and again through the same question. This is an opportunity for the children to record, so gather and record and begin to perhaps take some of their own notes as they're going along. But it's also how they gradually, bit by bit, begin to answer the inquiry question. Very often with poor use of inquiry questions, it's just plonked at the end like some kind of a heading. The inquiry question, I would say, is your power tool here, whatever outcome you're going for. The inquiry question makes every transition between lessons, between activities, live and breathe, because it's that moment in the lesson where you say to the children, now let's have a look at our inquiry question. How has what we've just learnt shifted the way we're looking at this question? Oh, now we've looked at this source, now we've listened to that argument from Fred, whatever it is. How does that make us look at our question differently? So you're keeping that inquiry question as a centerpiece all the way through. So I would say the quality of that outcome, whether it's something more creative, something critical, just free story writing, whatever it is very dependent on the quality of the journey towards it, the steps or stages en route, and how cleverly aligned they are with that ultimate inquiry question. If they shoot off in different directions, then I fear the final outcome will be trivial, superficial, or presentist. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you so much for your time. If you'd like more information, please visit our website. The URL is on the screen now. If you would like a quote, free trials, or if you have any questions, please email history.team@hodder.co.uk with your school name and school postcode. We will put you in touch with your local consultant. Thank you and goodbye.